Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone. Today we'll be talking with Stephen Kershnar. He is a distinguished teaching professor in the philosophy department at the State University of New York at Fredonia. He is also an attorney. Mr. Kershnar, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
What do you think is the value of thought experiments in philosophy?
So I think what thought experiments do is that they isolate the relevant factors. So we need to have sort of the method of difference, whereby we hold everything else fixed, but change one factor and see what effect it has. So I view that thought experiments similar to what goes on in science. We use it to try and identify which are the elements that are making a difference.
Now, can you please explain the trolley problem? I have had a number of different explanations given to me. How do you understand the trolley problem?
So the kind of traditional trolley problem is twofold. On one version, you have a trolley going down the tracks, and it's going to run over five people. But if you switch the track, I think to the right, then there's a person on the right track. Then you're going to kill one person. If you don't switch, it's going to run over five. And the question is it okay to engage in a killing, which occurs when you switch the trolley, or a letting die, which is where more people die. And so it's an issue that is a killing permissible, or is it more or should we are we obligated to have a letting die? The second version has, again, the trolley's going down the track towards five individuals, but there's a very large man on a track, and we can push him in front of the trolley, which will slow the trolley down so that the five can escape. And so that's another killing versus letting die issue. But there, killing the large man is the means by which we save the five. So there seems to be a difference in the way in which we view the one individual. When we turn the trolley, it's a foreseen side effect. When we push the fat man or the large man, we're using him as a means by which to save the five. So yeah, so the question whether it's the same case, whether it's a different case, and also what we should do in both cases.
So Michael Sandel of Harvard says that it's not really that different, or he uses the thought experiment to say, well, what if there's a guy who comes to the doctors just for a checkup, and he has the ability to, have seven of his organs harvested to save the lives of seven others? How is it different in principle to kill one person to harvest their organs to save seven lives versus pulling the lever on the trolley to kill one person in order to save the others? In both cases, you are ending one life in order to save the others.
Right. So I think the closer analogy is with regard to the pushing the large man in front of the trolley. There, you are killing one as a means by which to save the five. When you cut open the healthy patient, what you're doing is you're again killing the one to save the five. Redistributing the organs or using the individual to slow down the trolley seem to be morally similar. It depends on whether or not these two differ from turning the trolley, depends on whether or not you think intention matters. That is, does it matter that when you turn the trolley, the person who dies on the side is not the means by which you save the five, he's just a foreseen side effect. Whereas in the case of pushing the large man and cutting up the healthy patient, the individual who is killed is used as a means by which to save the five. And there's an issue because in both cases, all three cases, you're doing something which results in someone's death. There's an issue as to whether or not what's going on in the agent's head matters.
But very interesting. So, this book, Theory of Justice by John Rawls, he says, the principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance. This ensures that no one is advantaged or disadvantaged in the choice of principles by the outcome of natural chance or the contingency of social circumstances. This explains the propriety of the name justice as fairness. It conveys the idea that the principles of justice are agreed to in in an initial situation that is fair. So he's saying in order for us to realize what is just, well, my understanding, in order for us to realize what is just or unjust, we must first decide behind a veil of ignorance without knowing our future place in society what is just or unjust. Is this a valuable thought experiment or way to achieve the just society?
Well, I mean, I think it's an interesting thought experiment. I mean, whether it's correct is a side note. I mean, it's a separate issue. So, I mean, certainly it's one of the most important developments in the history of political philosophy, and certainly in the late 20th century. Is it the way to go? I'm not sure it's the way to go because I'm not sure that it allows us to respect rights. So, nor is it the way to maximize the good. So I'm not sure it's helpful because that arguably blocks the two best ways that we should think about normative ethics. So that's why I'm skeptical of it. When I mean, what Rawls is assuming is that things don't come owned. So in some sense, society, either they're unowned or society owns them. In any case, society can decide how to distribute them. Whereas if you think that, look, objects are owned, bodies are owned, then the principles that you might decide behind the veil of ignorance might not be the principles that are correct in virtue of the fact that things are already owned and then not free for the society to distribute.
In Anarchy, State, and Utopia, Robert Nozick says utilitarian theory is embarrassed by the possibility of utility monsters who get enormously greater gains in utility from any sacrifice of others than these others lose. For, unacceptably, the theory seems to require that we all be sacrificed in the monster's maw in order to increase total utility. So what I get that he's saying here is we each get, 10 units of utility by, eating food, but there's a certain monster that gets 1 million units of utility with no point of diminishing return. Therefore, if we care about increasing utility, all efforts should be geared towards pleasing this monster. Do you think there's any value in this thought experiment or its implications?
Yes, I mean, I think it's really useful. I mean, the way these arguments work is that you kind of roll up pros and cons or costs and benefits of different theories. So I do think that's a counterintuitive feature of consequentialism. Consequentialism says that the right maximizes the good. That is what we ought to do. Should maximize the good. And utilitarian adds to that when deciding what it is, what's good, what it is we should be maximizing, its utility or well-being. So I think it's a good point. I mean, it's not the only one, right? Utilitarianism would tell us that we should kill people who are depressed, if doing so would increase total or average utility, depending on which method you should have. It also tells you that you have a duty to reproduce. So, for example, imagine a couple, they're both attorneys and they have 2 children, and they could have had 5. The idea is that they really did something wrong in virtue of the fact that they prevented the world, 3 happy people from coming into the world. And that's perhaps worse than murdering someone. Why? Because in murdering someone, you're taking away 1 lifetime's worth of utils. In having only 2 rather than 5, you're taking away 3. So there are going to be all sorts of bizarre consequences of utilitarianism. I'll give you just one more example. Imagine I have a friend. I have a friend, Jim. And Jim's a really good guy. If there is heaven and hell, Jim's definitely going to heaven. But if he's going to heaven and that maxes out the number of utils, then nothing we can do is going to make the world worse, better or worse. Hence, there's no limit to the amount of evil we can engage in because it won't affect the overall amount of well-being. So, I mean, there's lots of oddball consequences of oddball results of utilitarianism. That's one of them, and there are others as well. I mean, to be fair, non-consequentialism, particularly rights theory, which Nozick is a proponent, and I think Nozick is great. I mean, I think his book and his work in general is fantastic. But I mean, there are some huge holes in the theory, So I mean, the utilitarian would take similar shots at Nozick, and say, well, that's embarrassing as well. So it cuts in both directions. I gather you're a fan of Nozick just because I see Nozick's picture on your Skype address.
You know what? I forget that it's there, and I should probably change it to my logo. But I just needed something. I just needed something a long time ago, and I picked him because I was really motivated by his work.
Well, and also your moniker, don't tread on anyone. That sounds very Nozickian.
I hope so. Do you see that utilitarianism is something that people kind of value in their current circumstance, but don't value historically? In other words, they'll say racism inherently evil. Don't bug me with the costs and benefits. Don't. I'm going to suspect you of being evil if you even tell me there's a benefit to racism or slavery or discrimination. But today, instead of thinking on principle, the biggest one for me is, I think conscription is forced labor and thus slavery against someone's will. But they'll argue with me for 30 minutes about the pros and cons of conscription when historically they're so okay with saying slavery was inherently immoral, racism is inherently immoral. Do you see that disconnect, or is that just something I'm
So
making up?
I agree with you about, as a side note, with regard to conscription. Do people care about consequentialism? Absolutely, I think they do when they vote, right? One of the reasons they vote is not just on the basis of justice, but also on the basis of who's going to bring about the best results. Sometimes when people pick an economic theory, right, which economic theory, they argue for it and they think in terms of consequentialism. So I think it's a fairly common way that people think. I also believe that it's tracking at least an important moral consideration. Whether it's the only one is a separate matter.
Okay. Final note on Nozick. He has something called the experience machine. Suppose there were an experience machine that would give you any experience you desired. Super duper neuropsychologists could stimulate your brain so that you could think and feel that you were writing a great novel or making a friend or reading an interesting book. All the time, you would be floating in a tank with electrodes attached to your brain. Should you plug into this machine for life, programming your life's experiences? How would you respond to that? Would you plug in, and why or why not?
So I actually go back and forth on that. I don't have a decided view. The strong intuitive view is that we would not plug in, and the reason knows it gives us three reasons we don't want to plug in. First, he says we want to be a certain sort of person. We don't just want to have the experience of being virtuous or brave or caring. We want to actually be that sort of person. Second, we want to have agency. We want to actually do things, not just have the experience as if we're doing things. And the third reason he gives is that we want to have contact with reality. We want to actually know things. We don't want to have the experience as if we know things. And that's a fairly strong intuition. On the other hand, in terms of what's in my interest, I'm not sure there's something in my interest other than pleasure. And because the experience machine gives you more pleasure than any other option, it's not clear that we shouldn't want to be hooked up to the experience machine for theoretical purposes, even though it seems intuitively distasteful. There are factors which make the experiment messy, and among the factors that make it messy are the fact that we're worried about other people, right? Not just what the effect in ourself is, but what is the effect of our actions on others. And you might think, well, we're going to harm others. We hook into the experience machine. And also, there's a risk factor, right? If you're not controlling the experience machine, how do you know they're not just going to plug in, one nightmare after another? So I am torn on the experience machine for theoretical reasons, and if I was making the decision purely on the basis of self-interest, it seems that we probably would want to be hooked up to the machine. On the other hand, intuitively seem not to, and then there are just some others, a moral reason not to, concern for others, and then just a risk factor.
Yeah. There is uh, I believe he was a professor of economics at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Hans Hermann Hoppe writes, quite commonly it has been observed that argumentation implies that a proposition claims universal acceptability, or should it be a norm proposal that is universalizable. Applied to norms proposals, this is the idea as formulated in the Golden Rule of Ethics or in the Kantian categorical imperative that only those norms can be justified that can be formulated as general principles which are valid for everyone without exception. So, do you think universalizing something is key to knowing whether or not it's just or unjust?
No. Um, I think the problem with universalization is that it's there are issues as to whether or not there's a restriction on how you universalize things. That is, standard accounting universalization is you plug in a situation and then an action. And so there's an issue, what are the limits to the way you universalize this? On top of the fact, I'm not sure how universalization is relevant. It seems to me what's relevant are things like, are you maximizing the good? Are you respecting people's rights? Are you satisfying whatever other moral considerations are relevant? Perhaps equality or exploitation or desert. But I'm not sure how the universalization is met, on top of the fact that you can always sort of narrowly describe things so it's universalizable. So, yeah.
Now, in Against Democracy, Jason Brennan gives the jury examples. He says, imagine we have 5 juries. The first jury is ignorant. They just ignore the evidence. The second jury is irrational. They're just biased. They're non-scientific. The third jury is impaired. So even though they tried, they're just so incompetent that they can't analyze information. The fourth jury is immoral. No, if you're black, Jewish, or Republican, they will convict you regardless of the evidence. And the fifth jury is corrupt. Anyone who gives them $10,000, they will come up with that verdict. He then asks, may we enforce the jury's decisions in these cases should the defendant submit to their authority? It seems not. In each case, the jury acts badly and everyone knows it. Intuitively, it seems that these jury decisions lack authority and legitimacy. His point is, all of those 5 criteria apply to voters in democracies. Therefore, we have no obligation to obey laws that exist as a cause or result of democratic decision making. What do you think about that?
Well, in general, I think Brennan's work's excellent, and I particularly like that book. I'm sort of a little mixed on the view that given the failure of the voters in terms to be informed and to think in a very clear manner, that they don't have authority. You might think if the state has authority, it has it because we validly consent to it. And if we validly consent to it, then we consent to it in terms of the flawed decision making. On the other hand, if we don't validly consent to it, then it doesn't seem to be it's hard to see why we should care whether or not the voters are well informed or rational. So I'm not sure why valid consent doesn't preempt the issue. I mean, he makes a good point that democracy is a pretty flawed method of decision making. And, some people have argued, well, look, there's an empirical issue. As flawed is it better than other methods? Other methods might involve no government or, more constitutional protection of rights or sort of non-democratic means. So there's kind of an empirical issue. So I think it's a fairly messy issue, but I think before we get to that issue, there's an issue of state legitimacy. That is, does the state have a right to coerce us? And sort of a related notion, do we have a duty to obey the state? I think that we first have to address that issue before we have to address whether or not democracy is fatally flawed. But what's your view about democracy?
I would say that democracy is morally justified insofar as the participants are engaging voluntarily. So I would say this is the principal difference between a organization that is democratically run and they're constantly voting like a worker cooperative versus a nation. Yes, they are very different in size, but in one case you have people voluntarily entering into contractual agreements. The other I just really see as being subject to mob rule. I wouldn't see it as any different whether a group called Congress is doing it or if Amazon says, you get to vote for our CEO once every 4 years and you have to abide by our laws and we get to tax your income. But if you want to change things, you can apply to work at Amazon. Maybe we'll hire you. Maybe you could work your way up the ranks and change the system from within. I just hold the state to the same standard as anyone else. So coercive democracy against voluntary democracy, I think is fine, even though there's still the shortcoming with the division of labor. So, I mean, I don't necessarily look at, the things I like my iPad, and say, God, I really wish more people had voted on how this was made. I'm like, thank God it was a small elite of intellectuals that write the books that I love, make the iPads that I like to learn on. So I'm not really that big of a fan of democracy.
I mean, I hear what you're saying. So when you say voluntary democracy, does that mean people can opt out at any one time?
Yeah, yeah. So it would be very much like a worker cooperative, which a lot of people, say is the great way of finally being liberated from the bourgeoisie. I don't see it at all.
So if I wanted to opt out on Monday and steal my neighbor's car on Tuesday, I couldn't be prosecuted for it?
Well, you would be prosecuted for stealing your neighbor's car, regardless of whether it was part of a democratic decision or not. The very act of stealing would still be taking property you haven't justly acquired. So I would see those as two separate issues.
Fair enough. I mean, I hear what you're saying. I mean, it is interesting, though, that you think that the criminal justice system exists independent of the state's authority. I'm not sure that that's correct. I mean, the state doesn't have authority over me. It's unclear why it can tell me what to do or not do. Now, of course, my neighbor could call on the state to protect his goods, but I'm not sure that, sorry, the criminal justice system can operate if the state is illegitimate.
Yeah, I read the work of Ed Stringham, who had a book published by Oxford called Private Governance, in which he makes the case that a lot of the reason we are secure is because of things like, alarm systems in our house, guns we have, the discipline of repeated interactions that give people an incentive to respect property rights. He says that that happens more so uh, as a causal result of markets as opposed to, the state. And certainly if you look at civil asset forfeiture, not to mention taxation to the tune of trillions, or the wars that states initiate, that maybe just from a cost benefit analysis, it's not worth having, maybe there's better ways to protect your property than the state stealing 40% annually.
Sure, and look, I'm highly sympathetic to that. I mean, but my concern is that things like the civil court system, unless we volunteered to, we validly consented to it beforehand, it's not clear why we should be bound by it. So some of these mechanisms, I'm a little worried, again, they presuppose legitimacy. I'm also a little more skeptical that in the state of nature, however sophisticated, that we would have um, peace and sort of clearly functioning markets. Perhaps we would, and I would hope we would, but I'm not fully confident that's the case. I'm not sure that we have historical precedent for that, and I suspect there's reason to doubt that things wouldn't degenerate pretty quickly, but perhaps I'm wrong.
I do want to continue with some of these thought
Sure.
experiments. I know that you have written about abortion. There is a paper that I came across by Thompson, A Defense of Abortion, and she
Yeah,
has
it's by far the most famous paper on the topic.
see, I never heard of it until 2 days ago. So,
All right.
um, the violinist is. You wake up in the morning and find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist, a famous unconscious violinist. He has been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have therefore kidnapped you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours so that your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from his blood as well as your own. If he is unplugged from you now, he will die, but in 9 months he will have recovered from his ailment and can safely be unplugged from you. So I guess the question is, do you have a right to unplug? Can you explain why this was so popular and why this is an important thought experiment and where you stand on it?
So it's an enormously popular and important thought experiment. This is one of, if not the most widely read philosophy paper in the world. The reason it was so groundbreaking was that traditionally the debate of abortion was thought to rest on whether or not the fetus has a right to life. But what Thompson was showing is even if you say that, whether or not the fetus is a person with a full set of moral rights, what Thompson's move was to concede that the fetus is a person, just like you or me. Say that concede that the fetus has the same rights that you and I have, but argue that still does not show that abortion is wrong, in particular, that's unjust. So what the violinist thought experiment shows is that you do not have a duty to save someone, even if you have less at stake than they do. So in the case of the violinist is going to die if you disconnect yourself. Nevertheless, because you didn't validly consent to connect yourself to the violinist, intuitively, it's just, more crudely, it's permissible to disconnect yourself, even though this was going to result in the violinist's death. So the more specific lesson that Thompson draws from this is that the right to life does not entail a right to be saved. So merely because the violinist has a right to life does not mean that the violinist has a right to be saved. So I think in terms of thinking about the structure of abortion, I think it's an incredibly helpful thought experiment. And I think that Thompson's work in general is just groundbreaking in lots of different areas. That said, in terms of thinking about abortion, I think the example is not the central one we should focus on. And the reason is because it's a letting die, right? So if you disconnect yourself from the fetus, the person who disconnects himself from the fetus, and the person who this story is about, he is letting the violinist die. In abortion, the fetus is killed, right? It's very, in most cases, leaving aside the abortion pill, in most cases, the abortion is killed. If the abortion is killed, then we have to say, okay, would it be okay to, let's say, cut the violinist in half, or is that not the proper analogy? So to your question, do I think it's an important thought experiment? Yeah, it's incredibly important. Do I think it's extraordinarily helpful? Yeah, I think it's extraordinarily helpful. Do I think it's the one that's most on point? No. And that's because the violinist case involves a letting die and abortion involves a killing.
Mhm. Do you have a closer thought experiment to understanding the root morality of the abortion argument?
Yeah, I have two. So
Yeah.
one is, imagine you're in prison and a person is, so you have a weaker person in prison, let's call him Sheldon, and then you have a big, powerful individual, let's call him Big Amp, right? So Big Amp has, the 450-pound bench, and, he's a sexual predator in prison. He's also hemophiliac. So the only way that Sheldon can defend himself is to use a prison knife, let's call it a shank, to defend himself against Big Amp. And so the issue is, can he kill Big Amp to prevent Big Amp from sexually victimizing him? Or if Big Amp was already sexualizing victim, and can he kill him to make him stop? My intuition is yes. I think most people's intuitions are yes, which shows that a bodily invasion allows for lethal force. So if the pro-choice side can show that pregnancy is morally similar to a bodily invasion, then there's at least an initial case to suggest that the woman can use lethal force to either prevent the bodily invasion or to make it stop.
And what is the second thought experiment you have?
Second thought experiment, and by the way, these are both, I have both these they're both from my book, Does the Pro-Life View Make Sense? The second experiment is where you have a Nazi woman who's in prison. A Jewish woman who's in a Nazi death camp. And the Nazi officers give her the following choice. You can either have sex with a Nazi officer, or you can carry a Nazi couple's fetus to term. And the question is, the first is going to be a case of rape, right? Because in essence, the third option is death. So you can be killed, you can, have sex with a Nazi, let's say officer, or carry a Nazi couple's fetus to term. So because we think that you can use lethal force to prevent rape, it seems that you could use lethal force to prevent that option. But if the third option, that is carrying the Nazi couple's fetus to term, if that were as much of an injustice or much of a right infringement as the sex, then that would suggest that that also warrants lethal force. And I do, in fact, think that a Jewish woman in that situation might have a hard time deciding which is worse, and that would be and there would be nothing wrong where she decide that the sex is worse than carrying the fetus to term, which suggests that the bodily invasion of a fetus is severe. That is, it is at least as severe as that of a rape. And because rape warrants the use of lethal force in self-defense, so does an unwanted pregnancy. So those are the two thought experiments that I use. They rest on they assume that the fetus does not have a right to be inside the woman, and that's going to require a separate argumentation. Separate argument.
And do you see the difference between, a woman being 5 months pregnant and not wanting the child versus having a 5-year-old child and, just deciding to not feed it anymore and essentially starve it? Is the difference between that the fetus would be considered a trespasser, whereas the 5-year-old is alive and able to, survive outside of the mother, therefore she has an obligation to find a household for it? Do you see a difference
Well,
there?
leaving aside the 5-year-old, there's a big difference just in terms of one is a bodily invader, the other is not. So
Yeah.
that's right. One involves a trespass, one doesn't. In terms of what is the obligation of the woman, you might think that she's validly consented to take care of the 5-year-old, and because she's done so, she then has an obligation, or at least she has to make sure that someone's going to fulfill that obligation before she ceases to do it. It's a little murky as to how we should think about that issue, but they're different is exactly for the reason you mentioned. One is a trespass, the other is not.
Okay. There is a movie called Don't Breathe in which a girl is driving drunk and then kills another girl. So the father of the girl who died kidnaps the girl who killed his daughter and impregnates her, so she can give him another child. Do you think, because that's the closest you can come to maybe just not retribution, but paying back something that you took away? Do you think that would be morally justified under any circumstance, forcing someone to have a child because they killed your child?
So I'd need some time to think through that thought experiment. My initial view would be no, because I'm worried about the way in which compensatory justice works in that instance. So, but to be honest, I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to take some time to think through it. So I don't have determinate thoughts on it. The name of the movie is Don't Breathe?
Correct. It's actually a horror movie, which I usually hate, but I loved this one. I thought
Yes,
this one was great.
I'm unfamiliar with it on this issue. I'd have to think about it. I mean, I'd have to think about the mechanism of compensatory justice, and yeah. So I'd have to think through it. Yeah.
Michael Huemer, a philosophy professor at University of Boulder, Colorado, has the Starvin' Marvin thought experiment, where he says Starvin' Marvin is going to the store, but it's in a different town. And in between towns, you stop him and say, I don't want your kind being in this town. You need to go back to your house. As a causal result of this, Marvin does not go to the store to get food and starves to death. He says, you are therefore responsible for his death. He then says this is analogous to governments stopping people from immigrating into certain geographical areas, and as a causal result, poor people stay in poor countries and die. Do you think it is morally analogous for immigration restrictions to equal you just saying, I'm going to murder you if you go to the grocery store without my permission?
Right. So, as a side note, Michael Huemer is an outstanding philosopher. Just a real pleasure to read. He's done breakthroughs in all sorts of areas, and just an intellectual giant. So, On this case, though, I don't agree with Michael Huemer. You might think there's collective property. So, for example, you might think there's a difference between going to the store where the store owner invites you in and going on to people's property when it's owned by a collection and the collection validly dissents from allowing you onto it, or does not validly consent to allow you onto it. So, for example, imagine there's a country club, a fancy country club in Westchester, New York. And the country club says, look, no one may enter here except for the members. And so you have a bunch of, let's say, a large group of, just as an example, group X, a large group of fraternity brothers decide they want to enter the fraternity, they want to enter the country club and use the facilities, go swimming, eat the food, play tennis on tennis courts, play golf, and relax in the steam room. And you might think, well, they have not been given permission by the people who own the country club, and it's collectively owned, so they may not enter. This is true even if, let's say, instead of fraternity brothers, let's say it's a bunch of starving individuals, and they want to break into the country club and eat the food to stay alive. Now, this might be permissible, all things considered, because their interest in staying alive might override the country club owner's rights, but it would still be unjust. It would be a case of overriding people's rights, or a case of injustice that was justified because of to prevent a catastrophe, but it would not be just. Similarly, if you think parts of the United States, like our roads and certain benefits we hand out, medical benefits, school benefits, for things like that, are collectively owned, then you might think that people may not enter and use collective property, even if doing so would have good results. As a side note, I'm not sure it would have good results, but there is an issue as to whether or not there's a property right infringement, and I think there is. So for Huemer's example to work, for Huemer's analogy to work, it would have to be the case that when the people came into this country without the permission, in fact, against the laws of the country, and started using the collective property and taking some of the resources, that this was not an infringement of anyone's collective right. I do not think that's correct. Mm-hmm. So again, I think it's a great thought experiment, and like I said, I read lots of Huemer's books. I mean, he's a fantastic philosopher, but on this one, I don't agree that he's right. Also, there's an issue of at what, so if you thought this were true, is there a limit as to how many people could enter the country? Right? So the U.S. has roughly 330 million people. Imagine that 1 billion people from around the world want to enter the country. Is there at any point we could say, hey, look, we don't want a country. We have 0.3 billion people today. We don't want a country of 1.3 billion. Would the response be, well, look, they're not infringing on anyone's property rights, so what's the objection? If they are infringing on someone's property rights, for the same reason you keep out 1 billion, you could keep out 1. So it seems to me there's an issue as to whether or not there's a property rights, whether there is a property right that's being infringed. I think there is. I think it's a collective property right. It's also the case that usually when people come across the border, they also cross private property, which is an individual property right invasion. So, yeah.
Thomas E. Woods Jr., a PhD from Columbia, says that imagine you have a society where Walmart controls the schooling system. They do this by taking a percentage of the value of what they say the value of your property is, and only some people are allowed to opt out of this. It's compulsory to fund, it's compulsory to attend. Some people can opt out, but you have to get Walmart's permission to opt out of the Walmart education system. And you spend a lot of time talking about the amazing accomplishments of the Walmart CEOs, and there's rumors the first Walmart CEO never told a lie, and without Walmart, terrible things would happen. Would this society, in any rational way, be able to justly judge the actions of Walmart? He says no. He says, well, for the same reason governments engaging in any sort of education funding, especially coerced funding, compulsory attended government schools, makes it so the well of democracy is so poisoned that it renders almost everything illegitimate. What do you think about this thought experiment?
So there's kind of two features to it. I'm not familiar with this one, but one feature of is should Walmart be able to coerce people? And this seems to be similar to the issue of, do we validly consent to the government? Now, there are three standard objections to the consent, to the notion that we justify the state through valid consent. One objection is that we simply don't do so, right? It's simply that it's not the case we validly consented. We don't take an oath, for an example. At least many of us have not. Second, the claim is even if we did validly consent, it would be involuntary. To use David Hume's example, it would be like someone on a ship at sea who was taken against his will and put on a ship, and the captain says, look, if you don't like my legitimate authority, feel free to leave. The price would be too high to leave. Similarly, the price is too high to leave the state. Some people can't even leave the state, so the idea is that either you can't dissent or the price of dissent is too high. The third objection, which comes from A. John Simmons, is that you need to give prior consent before the state even can give you this choice, right? You have to consent that the state, to put the state in a position by which it can give you the choice, either validate us through consent, that we have the standing by which to give you this choice, that for this territory, you can either consent or dissent, but what you can't do is you can't set up a separate government, you can't set up no government. Those are your options. So there's an issue as to how you get around those. Okay. So leaving those aside, the notion that you couldn't criticize a government, I'm not sure why that would be the case. We do criticize the government. The criticism of the government has resulted in vast changes of it. Some of these I don't agree with. In fact, a lot of the changes I don't agree with. But the fact of the matter is that we do criticize it, and we have mechanisms by which to change it. There are parts of the Constitution that tell us how we can change the Constitution and through it change the government. We have elected representatives that can vote for changes. So I'm not sure why the structure doesn't allow for change. His argument might be that psychologically it's very difficult to change once you have a group that's embedded in power. And I don't know enough about this. So I'm not sure that I see why in theory you can't change things. In practice, I'm not sure I know enough why you couldn't change the government.
Now, these next couple are not necessarily thought experiments, but just way of understanding concepts. John Hasness, I forget where he works, I should have written it down, but he wrote a paper called The Myth of the Rule of Law, and he says, before you travel to different states, you're able to go to other states without having to read all the laws, and you're able to cooperate with people. You're even able to go to different countries where people speak different languages without having to read all the laws of every country. Even in America, the First Amendment, when you read those words, for, freedom of speech, this still doesn't allow for sharing secrets in wartime, screaming fire in a crowded theater, doesn't allow for you to advocate violence against someone. So there's no objective rule of law for us to delegate to. All that could ever exist is the arbitrary, more or less, laws of some people. Do you agree with this?
Well, aside note, John Hasnas is another excellent philosopher, sort of always worth reading. So, do I agree with this? I mean, this is going to get us into a deeper issue as to whether or not there is such a thing as law, and also if there is, do we have a duty to obey it? So, I mean, there are different theories out there of what law is. On one theory, law is just a collection of rules with a certain structure to it. Right? There's one rule which sort of validates the other rule. The rule that validates them can't itself be validated. And that comes from H.L.A. Hart. Another theory, which comes from Ronald Dworkin, says the rule consists of some combination of rules and principles, and the principles fit and have to fit and justify the rules. So there's an issue as to whether or not either one of these things is an adequate description of what law is. And again, that's going to be a fairly complex issue. The separate issue is, do we have a duty to obey the law? And I guess I think that assuming that there is law, and if it is the case that the government has legitimate authority, and if it's further the case we have a duty to obey the government, then it would seem that we have a duty to obey the law. Now, you're right that when we cross into a new state, we don't look the laws up. Most people, never know what the laws are, at least in plenty of areas. And for a lot of people, even if they did look it up, it would be unreadable. The laws are, when you actually read them, they're surprisingly murky. So how can you be duty bound to read, to follow rules that you don't understand? It's not clear that you reasonably can understand them. So there's kind of an issue as to whether or not you ought to do something when it's not clear that you can know what it is that you ought to do. So I think that it does raise a very interesting issue. Again, it's going to get fairly complex here. There might be an issue: ought you to obey the laws, and are you blameworthy for not doing so? Or those are separate issues. So again, I think it's going to be fairly complex.
My final question for you is, if you could recommend 3 books to anyone interested in philosophy. They sort of have the love of wisdom. They want to be able to think rationally, see through the propaganda, not be manipulated, and, sort of have self-knowledge. What 3 books would you recommend?
Well, in terms of, I think the best books in terms of introduction to philosophy are these sort of collection works, because you see lots of different arguments. So in terms of someone who has not seen a lot of philosophy, I would get an introduction to philosophy book. The ones I've enjoyed over the years teaching are, this is, I don't know what version it's on now. I taught it years ago, which is Joel Feinberg's Reasons and Responsibility. The Louis Poyman's Quest for Truth, I find to be sort of really short and readable collection. In terms of political philosophy, you've cited Anarchy, State, and Utopia. I find that just a fantastic font of ideas. So these sorts of edited collections, I think, are the best entree into philosophy, because they allow you to explore a lot of the great minds. Reason at Work, put forth by George Scher, Stephen Kahn, I forget the other editors are. So any of these edited editions, I think, are an excellent entree into philosophy.
Excellent. Well, Mr. Kershnar, thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it. Please check out the description below to get access to Mr. Kershnar's books as well as his other work in philosophy. Sir, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for interviewing me. I really appreciate the interest, and I appreciate the excellent questions you asked. So it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.